Now I can't see my slides. All right. So I think we are now live. Welcome everyone to our Technical Friday, Forever Chemicals, Chemistry and Regulation. My name is Mike Pissarro. I'm the Policy Director here at the Watershed Institute. Some logistics on our Technical Friday. We are recording this. We will be sending out the recording in a follow-up email, and it will also be available on our YouTube channel. If you have questions, please put them in the question and answer function of Zoom. It should be either on the top of your screen or the bottom of your screen. We will be monitoring that. Generally, we keep questions to the end, but if something pops up that I feel like needs to be addressed, I will interrupt Kelly or myself to do that. So we have a land acknowledgement, which I have obscured with another screen. We recognize the land and water now under our care is the traditional and ancestral territory of the Lenape. We pay our respect to Lenape peoples, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the diaspora. We respect their knowledge, culture, and traditions that have contributed to the conservation of land and water. If you don't know the Watershed Institute, we are a watershed organization in central New Jersey. Our mission is keeping water clean, safe, and healthy. We work to protect and restore our water and natural environment in central New Jersey through conservation, advocacy, science, and education. We also administer several state programs. Oops, I hit way too fast. Sorry. Come on. Our strategies are scientific investigation and monitoring, advocacy for protection and restoration of watersheds and water, environmental education, and we model a lot of best practices at our LEED certified building and our 950-acre watershed reserve, which is open to the public. So here's a brief agenda. Obviously, the welcome and introductions. Kelly Colson is going to talk about the chemistry of these chemicals. I've been trying to figure out a better way to phrase that, but that is what it is. And then I'm going to go for the enjoyable discussion of how we're regulating them. And then we're going to have the Q&A and wrap up. Again, if you have questions, please put that in the Q&A. We will be monitoring that. We will be sending out the recording. You should be getting, if you have not already gotten, a link to the PDF of our presentations. If you are an attorney, we have applied for continuing legal education credits. We have not been approved yet, so there will be a verification form. And at some time during this program, I will be reading out a code. Please write that down in the verification form and then submit that to us afterwards. All right. I generally do not read bios, but we have our bios on the slides, which are provided. But Kelly Colon is a professional engineer. She's an principal engineer for Rowe and has been working on site remediation, environmental investigation, environmental design, wastewater treatment, stormwater management, and application of green remediation strategies in environmental litigation. I'm sure there's a few things you haven't done, but that is a complex and very comprehensive bio. And then my name's Mike. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing for over 25 years. I've been at the Watershed Institute as the policy director for the last 8.5, where I work both on the state and local level. And I'm licensed in the state of New Jersey. And with that, Kelly, I am going to turn it back over to you for the actual chemistry of these complex and emerging contaminants.
All right. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone, and happy Friday. My name is Kelly Coulon, and I'm a principal engineer at RUE. RUE is an environmental consulting firm headquartered in New York, but we have 10 offices throughout the country, including 2 in New Jersey, 1 in Somerset, and 1 in Logan Township. I'm here today to talk about the chemistry of PFAS and some of the challenges that we're seeing when addressing PFAS in the environment. All right, so let's start off with what are PFAS? I'm sure most of you have heard of them. PFAS is a long acronym for a family of chemicals. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Since it's a long name, we usually just go with PFAS. There are several thousand members of this family of chemicals. These chemicals all contain a carbon fluoride tail, which you can see in that chemical diagram, and a functional head group, which is denoted as X in that diagram. The chemistry of PFAS gives it some properties that has made it extremely useful for industry and for manufacturing and making consumer products. The carbon fluoride bond is one of the most stable bonds in chemistry, and as a result, it makes PFAS very difficult to degrade in the environment. But it made PFAS great for manufacturing and for certain products. It's stable at high heat, so it's been used for things like firefighting foam. The carbon fluoride tail of PFAS is both hydrophobic, which is water hating, and lipophobic, which is oil hating. This gives PFAS its waterproofing capabilities, as well as its stain resistant capabilities. So PFAS in general has low volatility and high solubility. And so this means that it is mobile in the environment. I think one important thing to note is that there is no natural environmental source of PFAS. So if you see PFAS, it is not from any natural source. It is from a man-made source of sorts. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the chemistry of the PFAS family. So I figured I would start with the 2 most researched and most prevalent types of PFAS, PFOA and PFOS. It's a little bit of alphabet soup when it comes to PFAS, so you'll just have to bear with me, but PFOA stands for perfluorooctanoic acid. All of these types of PFAS have a carbon fluoride chain, and it's really called the per or polyfluoroalkyl chain. That's a scientific name for it. When we say perfluoro, we're talking about all of the carbon bonding sites. So the carbon chain on this is really you can't really see the carbons, but it's in the middle of where these lines kind of converge. So the per refers to having all of those carbon bonding sites filled with fluoride. When we say poly, we mean that most, but not all, of those carbon bonding sites are filled with fluoride. The functional head group is shown in blue on these slides. In the case of PFOA, the functional head group is carboxylic acid. When we're looking at PFOS, which is perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, the functional head group is sulfonic acid. And so a little bit about the naming of these. The oct part has to do with the number of carbons in that carbon chain. For both of these substances, you have 8 carbons. And if you counted the bens in this, you would see that that accounts for 8. So moving forward, let's take a look at the PFAS family. So there are several thousand members of the PFAS family, and this is pretty a pretty big family. So I've shown some of the major PFAS family classes, subclasses, groups, and subgroups on this slide. But there are obviously, as there's over 4,000, there's many that are not included here. So this is kind of just to serve as an example. what we've seen so far is most research and regulatory concern with the perfluoroalkyl acids, or PFAAs. In particular, most of the work so far has focused on perfluoroalkyl carboxylic acids and the perfluoroalkyl sulfonic acids, with most research and most regulations focusing primarily on PFOA and PFOS, which are two members that we see highlighted in red here. So one of the big takeaways is that there's a lot of PFAS, or a lot of members of this PFAS family that there are no regulations for, that we don't really know much about necessarily when it comes to toxicity and prevalence in the environment. So when we're talking about PFAS regulations, this is really just the tip of the iceberg that we're seeing right now. As a result, for the environmental industry and for practitioners, there's a lot of regulatory uncertainty and concern about moving regulatory goalposts when we try to address PFAS in the environment. So let's talk a little bit about why PFAS is a problem in the environment. So what about PFAS chemistry makes it difficult to deal with? I thought this slide was interesting, especially for people with some background in environmental science, because it compares PFAS to some of the more difficult to treat contaminants that we've dealt with. It kind of shows that it has a lot of properties that make it problematic. For example, PFAS are a complex mixture. So I talked about, it's a big family. Oftentimes when we see PFAS in the environment, you're not just seeing PFOA, or you're not just seeing PFOS on its own. You're seeing a whole bunch of different types of PFAS all at the same time. A lot of products, when they were formulated, and a lot of the industrial uses, contain mixes and separate signatures of PFAS. As a result, what we have in the environment and what we have to deal with is a complex mixture. So we've seen this in the past with hydrocarbons, we've seen this with PCBs, and we're seeing this again with PFAS. PFAS is also really difficult to deal with because it is so stable. It's very resistant to degradation. And so a lot of the traditional ways that environmental consultants and environmental engineers would treat this contaminant just aren't as effective, or not effective at all, when it comes to PFAS. And you start to see similarities between this and some of the other more long-lasting chemicals in the environment, like PCBs, 1,4-dioxane, and chlorinated solvents. PFAS is also really tricky because it is so mobile in groundwater. This is similar to hydrocarbons, 1,4-dioxane, and chlorinated solvents. So basically, PFAS is a triple threat. It's complex, it's stable, and mobile. So it's not only that, PFAS is actually used a lot in the environment. I've listed a lot of different industries that used or manufactured PFAS. This is really just a handful of them. There are a lot more. Again, all of those properties of PFAS, the chemistry of it that make it so useful, has really led to its widespread use in a lot of industries. And it's not just in products, although that is a big issue. It's also in the actual manufacturing processes in some cases. I know a lot of people have probably used products with PFAS or different members of the PFAS family. I mean, it's things like your raincoats, personal care products, so your waterproof makeup. I think I've seen an article recently with even PFAS in toilet paper. So you do see PFAS almost ubiquitously in the environment, in low levels, and in some cases in higher levels as well. PFAS also has a long history of use. And I think, a lot of the regulatory concern has really been more focused in the 2000s, but it's important to know that PFOA and PFOS were used in the 1940s and 1950s. So we're seeing really long lifespans of when PFAS was used and when it could have potentially impacted the environment. This slide here, I like too, because it really gives you kind of perspective into just how long PFAS has been used, and some of the original uses as well, from nonstick coatings to stain and water resistant products, firefighting foam, or AFFF, I'm sure some people are familiar with. The other thing with this too, to keep in mind, is that this is again only looking at a few different select PFAS. There are a lot of other members of this family, and those members, most of them came in later in the game. So PFOA and PFOS began to be phased out in the 2000s, and that was really just due to environmental concerns. And a lot of other PFAS, typically shorter chain PFAS, ended up taking their place. So even though you had some PFAS phased out, some of them kind of came back in to take their place. Right now, I think the industry is looking to start shifting away from PFAS in general. So, we hope that continues, and a lot of it has to do with the liability and the risk of using it and having it have an environmental or human health impact in the future. All right, so to summarize really what I've said so far, PFAS is really challenging to deal with because it has a long history of use. It was used in a lot of different industries and in consumer products. It forms complex mixtures and typically was used in complex mixtures. It's mobile in the groundwater. It's a stable molecule, and it's resistant to degradation. In addition, there's increased regulations at low levels, and Mike will talk about that in a bit. So what does this mean for the environmental industry, and how does it impact what we do at a site? And this is really a work in progress. There's moving regulatory goalposts on this because more and more regulations coming out on PFAS. And so right now, while there's some in most states, federally, we're really just getting started. And even on the state level, we're just getting started. From a site-specific standpoint, if a lot of state programs require sampling for PFAS at this point, or there's rules underway to start requiring sampling. Sampling for more parameters means that your sampling is going to be more expensive. In addition, when you are dealing with PFAS, there are specialized sampling protocols. Now, the reason for this is that a lot of the environmental sampling equipment that we use actually has PFAS in it. Some of our jars, some of our tubing. In addition, personal care products like some deodorant, sunscreens, bug sprays can also have PFAS in it. So there's specialized sampling protocols for PFAS. One of the challenges that we see, again, is this moving regulatory goalpost. It's once you sample for PFAS, it doesn't necessarily mean you're done. As regulations continue to be developed and put through, it makes this whole thing fairly complicated. In addition, one of the other big things with site investigation work in PFAS is that because it was used by so many different sources, there's usually a decent amount of background conditions on sites, especially when you're looking in urban areas. So analysis of background conditions is incredibly important as well as evaluation of multiple sources. When it comes to remediation, the big picture is that cleaning up PFAS is hard. And as a result, it'll be more expensive. There are very few cost-effective approaches for PFAS destruction. So the remediation industry is working on this. There's a lot of technologies underway to help, solve this problem. But what we're seeing right now is that we don't really have a silver bullet for this. Some technologies are better at removing certain types of PFAS, but not others. Some will be able to partially destroy PFAS, but not completely destroy it. And because regulations are at such low levels, it's difficult to get destruction to a low enough concentration where you can meet regulatory closure. As a result, the typical approaches that we're seeing right now when it comes to remediation of soil are capping or containment remedies, as well as excavation and disposal. So excavation and disposal, if you're familiar with the remediation industry, is a really typical remedy, but it's actually really difficult to do in practice right now because disposal facilities often do not want to accept PFAS impacted waste. And this has a lot to do with the impending federal regulations on PFAS and just a lot of the uncertainty over how PFAS will be treated in the future. So while it seems like it's an easy technology to do, in practice, it's actually really difficult because of the disposal issues. When it comes to groundwater and drinking water too, the typical approach that we use for PFAS is pump and treat and filtering the PFAS through media, typically granular activated carbon or GAC, or ion exchange, which I have abbreviated here as IX. Both of these technologies, and there's a few other membrane technologies that work too, but these technologies basically will filter PFAS out of your water and concentrate it into either the media or the resin, depending on what exactly you're using. So while this approach does work, PFAS doesn't tend to necessarily absorb as strongly to some of these medias as we've seen with other contaminants. So you generally have to use a little bit more media than you would necessarily expect, especially when you have such low regulatory limits. So, and then you're still left with a disposal issue at the end too, because once you've concentrated all of your PFAS, you do have to send the resin or the media somewhere for regeneration. So you do have that disposal issue with these types of technologies as well. So that's pretty much all I had. So I wanted to leave everyone with a few key takeaways. Overall, PFAS is a big family of chemicals. It's been used for a long amount of time, and it's been used in a lot of different industrial and commercial applications. PFAS will continue to be an issue for years to come because of the chemistry of PFAS. Those stable bonds and the chemical properties of it make it very difficult to deal with in the environment because it doesn't like to degrade. And so that's why it's considered a forever chemical. As Mike will discuss, the regulations for it show that PFAS, even in small amounts, can potentially cause adverse health effects. Overall, the chemical properties and the chemistry that made PFAS so desirable commercially also make it extremely pervasive in the environment and difficult to treat. So that was all I had. I guess I will turn it back over to Mike, unless we have some questions.
Yeah, there was a couple. And we have a few minutes. So Kelly, when they're sampling for PFAS, is it for a single particular chemical, or can you test for the suite of chemicals, or somewhere in between?
Well, it's somewhere in between. So we can test for, I think, about 70 different types of PFAS right now. You can also run some tests that will test more for fluorinated compounds, and so that will give you a better idea of like your total potential PFAS, even ones that we don't necessarily have regulations for. So a little bit of both. I mean, the primary ones we're seeing from a regulatory side are PFOA and PFOS, but there's also, depending on the state or the jurisdiction you're working in, potentially more there. So our technologies are getting better and better too. So, in the future, I think we're going to be able to actually measure more and more different types of PFAS.
All right. Are you able to talk a little bit about sort of the health impacts of these chemicals?
Yeah, so I work with a human health risk assessor, and so she's usually the guru I go to on the health effects, but I'll try to give my 2 cents from my engineering perspective. So they are finding health effects at low levels, but there's no real signature disease associated with PFAS at this time. So, with asbestos, you had mesothelioma, but with PFAS, there's no real signature disease to it. In fact, I believe the most significant or statistically significant finding they find is high cholesterol. But as you can imagine, high cholesterol isn't very specific. So it's a little bit hard with confounding variables to really be like, oh, it's definitely from PFAS. There's some studies that show that PFAS has the ability to mimic other chemicals in the body, and it might interfere with signaling. But overall, like right now, there's a lot of research that's still ongoing to really pinpoint endpoint diseases caused by PFAS. So and because there's so many different kinds of PFAS too, it's a complicated picture. And when you're dealing with any sort of human model, it's always a complicated picture. So I hope that answered the question, but it's a very hard question to answer, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is one of the reasons it's called an emerging contaminant is we are learning more and more about it. From what I have read, and I am a lawyer, I do not at all play health advisor, doctor, or scientist. May have impacts on risk for cancer and birth defects, and a whole host of other things. But as Kelly mentioned, these things have been around for a very long time and have become very, very pervasive into our environment. All right. Let's see. And then the question, does it bioaccumulate? And I believe that answer is yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, some of it does leave the body too. I think there's been studies that look at human blood that have shown that, as PFOA and PFOS have been phased out, they've seen blood levels in humans drop too. So while it does accumulate, there's some hope too.
All right. Well, thank you, Kelly.
Yeah.
And I'm going to start talking about the regulation of these chemicals. All right. So, when we talk about control or regulate of these chemicals, it somewhat depends on the media. So is it soil, is it air, is it water, and how it got there? And also, I'm going to take a very sort of expansive view of regulate. Normally, when we think about regulation or regulate, we're talking about regulations, but I'm going to throw in a little bit about statutes and lawsuits. Because those things are going on in New Jersey and likely throughout the country. States throughout the country have started to, over the last several years, come up with standards. Those have been varied, but I'm going to focus mostly on New Jersey with a little bit of touch on federal EPA. So, as I said, one of the things is what are we regulating and what that media is? Is it air? Is it water? So, for example, as a watershed organization, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about water, but we have the Water Pollution Control Act here in New Jersey, which generically will make it unlawful to discharge any pollutant without a permit. And I've highlighted two words, discharge and pollutant. What do those mean? Discharge, probably common sensely, but as law and attorneys, we need to define all these terms. The intentional or unintentional release, spilling, leaking, pumping, emitting of a pollutant into the waters of the state. And that brings in some more. So pollutant, it's a long list. It's basically anything you can put into the water, even thermal, chemical, biological materials can be a pollutant. And hazardous pollutants, or any substance regulated under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and something Act, I forget what the R stands for, TSCA, RCRA, all the federal statutes, ID'd as a known carcinogen regulated under New Jersey Spill and Compensation Act. And then waters of the state has not been subject to the sort of controversy as the waters of the United States are, which may be a whole separate webinar sometime in the future, because after 50 some years of the Federal Clean Water Act, we still don't know what a water of the United States is. But in New Jersey, we know waters of the state basically is any water, natural or artificial, and it includes surface and groundwater. So all of those come under the Water Pollution Control Act and the implementing regulations. Air pollution, again, it's very similar to the Water Pollution Control Act, but you may not emit outdoors any substance, and those substances would be those that would be in quantities injurious to human plant, it should be plant, not plant, or animal life, or to property. And it's in quantities injurious to humans, and that sort of comes into play, not in this context, but when we talk about greenhouse gases and climate change, because carbon dioxide obviously is a substance that is normally occurring in the air, but arguments are made that since we are doing a lot more of it, that it is quantities injurious to human health and plant or animal life. Excuse me. And then there's a bunch of other sort of statutes or regulations in New Jersey that can come into play when it comes to the regulation, control, or remediation of these chemicals. The Industrial Site Recovery Act, otherwise known as ISRA, which is sort of the statute that requires the remediation of contaminated sites upon the transfer of ownership. We have the Spill Compensation and Control Act. Again, any person who has discharged a hazardous substance or is any way responsible for that hazardous substance may be liable for the cleanup and removal costs or the actual removal of those. We have the Brownfield Contaminated Site Remediation Act, again, that comes into play when properties become contaminated. And I mention these because I'm going to talk about some lawsuits, and all of these statutes have come into play with those lawsuits. And we also have the surface water quality standards. So these are a set of regulations under the Water Pollution Control Act that DEP has adopted, which set standards for the health of waterways, the health of our water. They will set either a quantitative standard. You may not have more than X amount of this substance in the water for that water to meet standards, or a narrative standard. You may not have a quantity of this substance, which we haven't really defined the actual quantity that we may have a negative impact on invertebrate life, drinking water, etc. Groundwater standards as well, somewhat similar. The Safe Water Drinking Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and its regulations, and the NPDES or NJPDES permits, so the New Jersey Pollution Discharge Elimination System permits. So this is the system that New Jersey has set up when we are directly discharging, so that the definition I started with in the Water Pollution Control Act, for waters, we are discharging substances from a point source into a waterway. And I'm sure there are others, but this is sort of a broad brush of the various regulations that may come into play with these chemicals. The history, and again, I may have missed a little bit, but in general, New Jersey has been looking at these since at least 2007. So the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection has issued a guidance level for PFOA. And then the New Jersey Drinking Water Quality Institute, which is a sort of an advisory board of experts, they recommended the setting of a maximum contaminant level. That is for drinking water, how much of that substance can be in the drinking water and still be healthy. For the PFNA at 13. There were interim groundwater standards for PFNA at 10. In 2017, DEP proposed the PFNA standards for drinking water. We updated the guidance level for PFOA from the 2007 number from 40 to 14. 2018, we adopted the groundwater standards. And then we adopted for the PFNA standards of 13. And then we issued interim groundwater standards of 10 nanograms per liter for PFOA and PFAS. So a lot of that, some of it was regulatory and enforceable, some of it was guidance. And then in 2019, DEP proposed amendments to a series of regulations, the discharges of petroleum and other hazardous substance rules, the groundwater quality standard rules, the Private Well Testing Act rules, the Safe Drinking Water Act rules, and the New Jersey Pollutant Discharge Elimination System rules, or the NJPDES permits, dealing with PFOA and PFAS. Excuse me. Those rules were proposed, out for comment, and then in March 31st of 2020, so just over 3 years ago, these rules were adopted. And so what does that really mean? Very broadly requires for the Private Well Testing Act, the testing of PFNA, PFOA, and PFOS starting on December 1st of 2021. So the Private Well Testing Act only applies in a couple situations. So if you have a private well that services is your home, or you are a landlord who are renting out a house or units to a tenant, the Private Well Testing Act applies to you. The Private Well Testing Act comes into play when you go to sell a home. You have to have a test done before the sale. So as of December 1st, 2021, these 3 chemicals were added to those series of chemicals or substances that have to be tested. Radon, arsenic, fecal coliform, and a few others are, some of the substances under the Private Well Testing Act that have to be tested for. This is a sort of a testing and notification law where you have to test for it. You have to notify the buyer of the results, but you don't necessarily are required by law to make any remediations. The practical effect, I used to do real estate in private practice. If these substances were arsenic or radon, fecal coliform are in, mortgage companies are going to require the remediation before they will lend. So it really, not in all cases, but require the remediation. Public community water systems and non-community water systems had to start monitoring starting June 1st, and the MCL, so that level of contamination that is below which is safe for human consumption, went into effect on June 1st of 2021. So all of our drinking water systems had to start testing, monitoring for these substances, reporting to DEP, and they had to treat so these levels were below what was set in the rules. And so here are the standards that have been set. Some of them in parts per trillion, some of them in parts per billion. So groundwater, if that groundwater is serving or designated for drinking water, it is set at this for PFOA 14, similar for drinking water, the PFNA 13, PFAS again 13. As I mentioned earlier, the standards, if it's not for drinking water, are different. And the reason there's the ecological standard, which may be lower or higher. And then there is the health standard, the MCL, which is what has been deemed safe for human consumption, given current knowledge and technology. Soil remediation also has standards. And that really depends whether it is residential. So is there a housing development or residents are going to be on it, or non-residential? Those standards are different depending. And we're going to have a webinar in September on actual site remediation of these chemicals and treatment from a drinking water perspective in September. But again, as part of a remediation process, you may be remediating soil as well as groundwater, so you have to deal with two different standards to address. So this is what the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection adopted for PFOA and PFAS in 2020. The PFNAs were done a little bit earlier from a groundwater and drinking water perspective, but that went into effect. Then there is the level of federal regulation. Again, somewhat broad brushed here, and there were guidance documents and health studies done before this. But in September of 2023, EPA proposes regulations that would classify PFOA and PFAS as a CERCLA, so Superfund as a hazardous substance. That comment period has ended. And we're waiting for those rules to be proposed. Can take a significant time for EPA to do that. They're not necessarily under the same restrictions that New Jersey is. In New Jersey, you have to propose and adopt within 1 year. Doesn't necessarily apply the same in the federal system. Currently, in March of 2023, EPA proposed regulations for drinking water for PFOA, PFAS, as well as a bunch of other PFAS chemicals. Those are currently out for comment. That comment period ends on May 30th of 2023. And then sometime thereafter, EPA will adopt or not adopt or modify based upon the comments that are received. Also, I believe it was in April of 2023, issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. So sort of a stakeholder process, sort of wanting to get comments before they go ahead and do rulemaking on the whole series of PFAS chemicals as CERCLA hazardous substances. Those comments are due on June 12th of 2023. So those are coming, those are out, and then once they do the advanced rulemaking, they will consider those comments and then may at some point in the future go forward with additional rulemaking. But for the drinking water, the PFOA and PFAS, this is what EPA has proposed. From a drinking water perspective, a MCL of 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFAS. Now, this is tricky. So they've set the MCL, the maximum contaminant level, at 4. That is not necessarily what EPA's standard is ultimately going to be or should be, or what the level of safe amounts of these substances are. That's really the MCL goals, so the maximum contaminant level goals. As you can see, the actual goal that EPA has set out for these chemicals in drinking water to be safe is 0. The problem with that, and why it's a goal and not necessarily the MCL, the standard actually set, is because we cannot test below 4 at this point. And there's some other complications. So as Kelly mentioned, these chemicals are everywhere, and it is in some of our testing equipment. And special precautions have to be made, but the level of detection really can't go below 4 at this point. So it's very difficult to set a standard that you can't test to see whether you've met, which is why those are set up as 4. And then they've set up what's this health index, MCL, and there's a whole series of these, and I was, to be frank, trying to noodle through exactly what that meant. But my understanding is any combination of these chemicals, if you put those in the formula, so 10 parts per trillion of PNFA and 8 PFAS, you put those in, put in the floor, they cannot exceed 1. I'll be honest, I need to do a little more research and sort of really understand how that chemical and formulas work. But they have set it for a whole series of chemicals, which I think is really the bigger takeaway. So they have taken not every of these chemicals, but a large track of these chemicals. I think there's 5 or 6 additional ones that they're looking at regulating on a standard without actually doing it chemical by chemical by chemical. One of these sort of shortfalls that we have in a lot of our environmental regulations are they have to set standards, have to prove that each individual chemical is unsafe or provides a health risk versus a series of chemicals, a family of chemicals. So this is probably one of the few times that EPA has set out a set of standards for a series of chemicals, sort of more generically, and it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Now, you will note, and I will go back up, and they've set a 4 for PFOA and PFAS, which is above, which is more restrictive than what DEP set 3 years ago. So these rules will go into effect, assuming they are adopted, and I believe they give a period of time of a couple years to get drinking water, water treatment plants in line to meet those standards. So there's going to be a conflict right now between what New Jersey does and what EPA has proposed, assuming those standards go into effect, assuming they are not challenged, and assuming those challenges aren't successful. So there's a bit of uncertainty, at least in New Jersey and maybe some other states, of what standard to reach, to meet, while all this is sort of shaking out and being proposed and adopted. And again, there's almost certainly going to be challenges to the standards on the federal level, as they are very, very low. And we will see how that shakes out. Now, as I mentioned, there's a couple different ways to regulate. So there are the regulations, which we talked very briefly about. And then there are lawsuits for contamination. So right now, DEP in the state of New Jersey has filed 7 lawsuits, I believe it is, against various companies for these forever chemicals. There are several lawsuits against DuPont, 3M, Chemours, Corteva, Solvay, Arkema for contamination of sites. So, I mean, this was interesting. I took a look and read through some of these lawsuits, and it was almost the laundry list of environmental regulations here in New Jersey. There's obviously the site remediation, the ISRA contaminations. You have contaminated the soils. These chemicals were being manufactured in the 30s, 40s, 50s, etc., where our standards were very, very different. We would, stockpile waste in unlined pits. And then, as standards improve, things happen, but, these chemicals got into our soils. It got into our groundwater. So, DEP filed a lawsuit for site remediation, for groundwater contamination, for surface water contamination. And it was interesting as I was reading these, and there was an air pollution. So these chemicals get emitted into the air in various mechanisms. And then there is air deposition, miles away, that these chemicals then, according to DEP's allegations at least, contaminated groundwater and surface water and soils outside of these manufacturing sites because of that air transport. So these lawsuits are going on. They have not been settled, solved, resolved. They've been going on since 2019. And the sites are involved various locations that were owned by these companies. Pompton Lakes, Parlin, Chamberswork, which is in Carneys Point, Rapano, which is in Gibbstown and Greenwich Township, and the Solvay site, which is in West Delpford. So these are going on. DEP has, again, a series of allegations against the companies that, almost any way you could contaminate an environmental resource in New Jersey, these chemicals found their way to do it. And then there is a statewide lawsuit against several manufacturers of firefighting foam. These firefighting foams have contained the forever chemicals for a number of years. They have been used throughout the state, throughout the country, really. And those chemicals have then leached into the ground, surface water, and groundwater as well. So there is lawsuits against these companies for manufacturing a product that was not safe. There's products liability, failure to warn, as well as the RCRA, CERCLA, ISRA, violations of the surface water quality standards, etc. Again, these lawsuits are still in process and haven't been resolved. So, we will see allegations in a complaint. Why I tend to believe DEP in this case isn't necessarily the truth. In discovery, depositions, and a trial will turn out to find out what these companies knew and what happened and their responsibility. And then legislation. I'm sure there's a lot of other legislation throughout the country on these chemicals, but New Jersey has at least 2 bills currently in the legislature dealing with PFAS. They were introduced in October of last year, A 4758 and S 3117. So they're companion bills, Assembly and Senate bills. And they basically do 2 things. One, within 1 year of the adoption or enactment of this law, assuming it gets enacted into law, would require manufacturers of products that contain PFAS to report that to DEP. And there's a series of things they have to do: describe the product, the purpose that the PFAS serves in the product, how much of it is in it, some contact information for the manufacturer and person responsible, if DEP needs additional information, and there's a payment of fee. And then within 2 years, a manufacturer cannot sell these products if they don't do the reporting. So there's an actual sort of hook or a hook to get the reporting. And then again, should be within 2 years, the state is going to ban the sale of, not the manufacturer necessarily, but the sale of several forms of products. So cosmetics, carpet and fabric treatments, food packaging, cookware are all going to be banned 2 years after the enactment of these proposed bills. So that will be interesting to see. Like I said, they were introduced towards the end of last year. They were referred to a committee. As far as I can tell, they have not had a hearing on committee. They're not scheduled to have a hearing on a committee yet. They have to go through committee hearings. They might have to go through a budget hearing committee before they get addressed by the full Assembly and Senate, and then given to the governor to sign into law. So here's, one thing that is going on that can have some direct and indirect regulation of these substances in our environment in New Jersey. Something to be aware of and is going on. I failed to mention, as I mentioned, there was 7 lawsuits in New Jersey. There are a series of other lawsuits throughout the country. I was reading the other day, there was a class action against Burger King for using these forever chemicals allegedly in their food wrappers. There is other lawsuits going on or have gone on and resulted in settlements from the various companies over the years. So it is an area that is really emerging. It is, as we are learning more and more and more about these chemicals, a little more alarming about their potential impacts and the fact that really there is no good way to get rid of them once they're in the environment. And with that, as I mentioned, this is part 1 of a 2-part series. We are going to have a second set of webinar on this chemical. I have a licensed site remediation professional and a representative from a drinking water company to talk about how they treat these chemicals, how they remove them from the environment from a site remediation perspective. That is September 8th. We will have registration up very shortly about that. And with that, I am going to open up some questions here and see what we got. All right. And Kelly, I think I sort of answered this one, but maybe you know a little bit better. Are the testing systems for drinking water sources capable of detecting and verifying 0 PFAS chemicals? So I think the answer is no, which is why EPA set it at 4, but see if you know.
Yeah, I know that there's limits to laboratories detecting PFAS. I don't know what exactly they are off the top of my head. It's like nothing is really 0. It's just a matter of what decimal point you want to go out to. I don't know off the top of my head, but it is pretty low. Like they are getting in the parts per trillion range. Not quite sure how much deeper than that.
Yeah. I was trying to come up with a good graphic to explain parts per trillion, and I couldn't come up with it, but I mean, it is a testament to the level of protection that the government is looking to get. And it's also a testament to the potential impacts even a very, very small quantity of these chemicals can have. And that's the problem. And as detection limits get lower and lower, standards may go lower and lower. Because as I mentioned earlier, it's very hard to regulate something you can't detect. In some areas we do that in New Jersey, but it's kind of hard. So let's see. So another sort of question / comment, the biggest issue with these forever chemicals is that our government has known since the 70s about the dangers, and finally now something is being done. The burden is falling on the suppliers and the public. This is unfair while the manufacturing producers continue to make billions of dollars. So as I mentioned, I read a lot of the lawsuits that the state of New Jersey has filed. And again, these are allegations. But if these allegations are true, it is very concerning. It's sort of similar to the tobacco industry and that history where the impacts and knowledge of the interactions of these chemicals is alleged to have been known for a very long time by the manufacturers. And again, alleged, I'm going to be a lawyer here, and alleged that the manufacturers hid that information from the public and the government. But yeah, I mean, at least since the early 2000s, the understanding of these chemicals became more and more widespread. As I mentioned, DEP issued guidance back in 2007 on some of this. Between different administrations taking different tacks, things have taken longer or shorter than maybe they should. I know reading some of the comments in the adoption document for New Jersey's drinking water, there was a real concern that these chemicals are so prevalent that you're now making property owners, manufacturers who may have had no actual responsibility in the discharge of these chemicals having to deal with them. One of the comments, and I'm not going to, comment on the accuracy of the statement. Well, if it's in our rainwater and we are doing stormwater management, we might be infiltrating these chemicals into our groundwater without any responsibility for actually putting it there. So how do we stay informed without panicking? That is a good question, because there is a ton of information out there. It seems like every other day there is another news article about these chemicals. I saw a headline, I didn't go to read it, about them being in contacts. I mentioned the legislation is having them, in our cosmetics. Kelly mentioned them being in our beauty products and sunscreen. I don't know, Kelly, do you have an answer to that one?
Yeah, I mean, it is a little hard to deal with, and there's just so many unknowns about the science and the toxicity around it right now that it's hard to think about, what it all means about what kind of PFAS you have come into contact with, and like your own personal health. From a technical perspective, one of the better resources for the science is the ITRC website. They maintain a very up-to-date website with a lot of the science behind PFAS, including a bunch of fact sheets, and they update it based on updated regulations, updated remedial technologies. So if anyone was more scientifically inclined, that's one of the better resources out there.
Great. We'll put a link when we send out the follow-up to this email. All right. I believe I answered this question. The feds are going to have a national enforceable standard of 4. So, yep, talked about that. Yeah, I mean, and the question about impacts to water suppliers and the huge cost to remediate. That is something we will have to struggle with, because there is a cost to remediating it. As someone mentioned to me the other day, one of the ways to remediate from drinking water is activated charcoal. We will need a lot of that. So, all right. Let's see, I recently went on a tour of my local sewage authority and was surprised to learn that these are coming in faster than I can read them. I was surprised to learn that there is more microplastic in the water after it's clean than before. I don't know. It was explained to me that this is due to the PVC pipes used in the facility and that the water sits in exposed tanks subject to air pollutants. Yet it's considered clean and safe for consumption. Does this include PFAS? I guess the question is, does our treatment systems, and maybe this is a question for part 2, does our treatment of these for water, drinking water, add PFAS to it unintentionally? I think we're going to hold that one off for part 2. Okay. With the rapid rate of new discoveries about mechanisms of forever chemical impacts on a metabolic, endocrine, epigenetic permutations in humans and other organisms, can the EPA's new standards survive challenge as a conservative approach under the conditions of remaining scientific uncertainty per the Scientific Advisory Board's review? I could barely pronounce half that. So Kelly, if you are able to answer that one, great. If not, we will try to find an answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So a lot of the uncertainty hasn't really stopped the litigation. And so I think that's one of the interesting things. Even lack of regulation and all the uncertainty hasn't stopped litigation, and not just for environmental contamination, but for personal injury and those types of litigation as well. So it's a great question. It's just a very hard one to answer. I mean, I think that the EPA is still trying to get something out there, but as far as how a numeric standard will survive or be challenged or change over time is really, I think it remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think given how low that standard is in comparison to what previous guidance, I mean, up until recently, EPA was not setting standards. They were issuing guidance, which was an order of magnitude greater than 4. It will be challenged. Whether that challenge is successful or not will be several years and many, many lawyers later to figure that out. I have not heard that New Jersey standards were challenged in court. So at the very least, New Jersey has a set of standards in which is being enforced. And then who knows what the next administration does? And that's always a question. We saw that with Waters of the United States. We've seen that on multiple things. One administration comes in and undoes a lot of what the previous administration does. And then the next administration comes in and undoes what was undone. So this is why these webinars are going to be evergreen. We can do them every few years and have whole different sets of information. Next question. Yeah, you know what? Whether these chemicals are in dental floss, they're in toilet paper, they're in a lot of things that you would not expect. I did not go back and detail what they deem cosmetic products or some other things. So they may be included in that definition. I don't think toilet paper is. Hopefully it's not. But being that these have not been into a committee hearing, getting amendments may not be that hard. If we can show that they are a significant impact, we can do that. So, we can reach out to the sponsors, which I will put into our follow-up, because I off the top of my head forget who the sponsors are of those bills, and people can reach out and ask for amendments. Environmental organizations can do that as well. All right. So next question, we are planning to install a whole house filter. What should we know from your knowledge and experience? Wow. Again, that may be one for the September webinar. As I said, and Kelly, I don't know if you have anything to add, but activated charcoal has been found to be effective.
Yeah, activated carbon is effective. I mean,
carbon.
So the drinking water, if you have a public water supply, your drinking water should be tested, and it should theoretically be all right with PFAS. Activated carbon has shown good efficacy for removing PFAS, but it's one of those things. It's always a matter of how often you change your filter, right? And it's like that with other contaminants too. But if you replace it soon enough, then it should have some efficacy. But it really just depends on what's coming in, what other things you have in your water, and how much is okay coming out. So it'll help. It's a tough question to be very definitive on because of the science behind it and some of the complexities with it. So
Yeah.
hopefully that
So
helps a little.
if you have a filter, I know I have a filter on my refrigerator, drinking water, and it glows orange when it's getting old and red. And if I don't change it, it's not going to really work very well.
Yeah.
And as Kelly alluded to, the drinking water companies that are supplying drinking water to a vast majority, almost half of New Jersey, are required to monitor this continuously, have quarterly reports, and if there are exceedances, they're supposed to notify you. They also are required on an annual basis to send out a report on the quality of water that they are supplying to their customers. If you have a private well, no one is testing that if you aren't doing the testing. And the state only requires testing when you go to transfer that ownership, or if you're renting your landlord, and I forget the threshold of how many units, but every 5 years. So you are able, I'm a hazard to guess, you can hire someone to come out and test your water for these chemicals. It's not going to be inexpensive. And at one point, the number of labs in New Jersey that could do it was 2. That may have changed over the last couple of years. But I saw those comments being made in the response to comments document. But if you are in a private well and you are concerned because it is in our water, in our groundwater, it is in our surface water, you can get, I'm going to take an educated guess, you can get it tested. How much and to what level they can detect is a different story. All right. And I think that is all of the questions we have. I'm just going to check the chat for a second. And as I completely forgot, if you are an attorney and you are looking for your CLE credits, which hopefully we will get approved, your special code is 0512. That is 0512, and that is only for people who want continuing legal education credits, assuming the state of New Jersey's Supreme Court will approve it. So let's see. I'm trying to pull up the chat, but for some reason it is not. It's probably behind something. So do you see any questions in the chat?
Yeah, I see
Okay.
lots of questions. As Kate Talon's asking, are there funding opportunities for municipalities, especially in areas where there are already there's already been traces of this in the drinking water?
We will hold that question for part 2.
Let's see. Dr. Brown was asking if PFAS chemicals are still used, I guess, and things.
Yeah, the answer is yes. There's been some commitments to some of the major manufacturers, one in particular committed to stop manufacturing all PFAS chemicals by 2025. So we're seeing movement on it being phased out, but it's not there yet. So
We had another question, I guess, for you, Kelly, that was, or actually for Mike, maybe, is the DEP standards parts per billion or parts per trillion? I don't know if that was.
It is parts per trillion.
Okay.
Well, for groundwater and drinking water, the soil remediations is parts per billion.
yeah.
Yes, and then Jim was asking, are there state or federal programs? Oh, this is probably next time too, to provide financial assistance to homeowners to install home treatment systems.
So I will have to dig a little into it. I think there are some opportunities under the Spill Act for some ability for some cost remediation there, but I will, again, we'll punt that to part 2 and I will get answers between now and then. All right. Well, with that, again, I want to thank everyone for attending our webinar. Kelly, thank you very much for providing your time and expertise. I've learned a lot, and from just listening to you, I've learned a lot trying to pull this presentation together. And again, this is an area, I mean, it's called emerging contaminants because it's emerging and we are learning more and more. And we will continue to learn more and more about it. Again, thank you very much. If you are an attorney, please fill out the verification form and send it back. Once we get notification from the courts that we got approved, we'll send out your certificate of attendance and for credits. The next webinar for Technical Fridays on Forever Chemicals is on September 8th. So that is a Friday from 12 to 1:15 again. And again, everyone, thank you very much and have a good afternoon. Kelly, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks.